by now, everyone will know that Turkey has been selected as the host of the 31st Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will take place in November of 2026, and has been selected ahead of Adelaide in Australia as the preferred city. Well, actually, it wasn't really selected. It was more that Australia dropped out of the race in reasonably controversial circumstances during the meeting, which is currently happening in the Brazilian city of Belém. And so this update today is just a brief analysis of what's actually gone on. And just to give a bit of background, the rotational system that the UN uses to select host cities basically at this point in time was for European countries and others, and the group acronym is called WEOG, and essentially Australia is part of that others group, and Turkey is effectively part of that group as well. And both countries originally submitted their bids to host the Conference of the Parties back in 2022. So this has been going on for some time. And the Conference of the Parties is a reasonably big event, and there are as many as 50,000 people who attend those particular meetings. Obviously, only a handful or a few thousand are actual negotiators, and a lot of business and non-governmental organizations, media, other stakeholders go to those conferences. So they're a huge event, and they bring the focus of the world onto particular countries and areas when they're being hosted in specific locations. So really, it's quite an enormous event, and hosting such an event does require a lot of logistics. It's quite expensive and so forth. And from an Australian perspective, they were also looking to host the event on behalf of the Pacific Islands as a group. So the conference itself would have been held in Australia, but it would represent, if you like, the interests of the Pacific Islands. And as we know, when it comes to climate change, the Pacific Islands are particularly focused on this issue because they stand to lose the most relative to other countries being island nations from things like sea level rise to the extent that they're going to happen. So it's a very important event, not just for climate change, but also in relation to the overall diplomatic picture between Australia and the Pacific Islands in an environment where China is making increasing efforts to engage with Pacific Islands. So that's a bit of a background to what has gone on. Now, it's important to also point out that the United Nations rules for deciding host cities are basically that any competing cities need to be able to agree that who's going to be the host city themselves, and if they can't agree, that actually it would be escalated such that eventually it would be assigned to Germany, because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat actually has its offices and facilities in the city of Bonn in Germany. So the default option would have been, if no one could agree, that it would actually go to Germany, and the conference would be effectively held there. Now, the reports coming out, and there's in particular a very good report done by a carbon market media outlet known as Carbon Pulse, published a story a couple of days ago and actually made it available for public access. So I'm going to actually put the link to that story in the description below. It's understood that Germany had expressed to Australia that it did not want to host the conference in the event of a deadlock between Australia and Turkey. And as a result of that, actually asked Australia, or put some request to Australia to actually drop the conference so that Turkey could then host it and try and do some other kind of deal whereby Australia could still have some prominent role in the Conference of the Parties, so that the situation in which Germany would have to host the conference would be taken off the table. It's quite unusual to see that. Just to point out as well that Germany did actually host in 2017 in Bonn a Conference of the Parties, which was officially hosted by Fiji in terms of the overall chair's position of the conference itself, but the conference was held in Bonn instead of in Fiji. So that actually happened in 2017. So no more than 8 years ago, a conference of the parties focused on Pacific Islands was actually held in Germany. But on this particular occasion, at least according to the reports, Germany was quite keen to avoid hosting the conference in Bonn. And for those who have been to Bonn and to the UN Climate Change Secretariat, they have wonderful facilities there. And so actually, the inconvenience to Bonn to actually host a conference of the parties is relatively low because all those facilities are there. People know the hotels. The transport to and from Bonn is very well known and very well organized. So actually the logistical challenges would be much less having the conference in Bonn. But for some reason, the German government didn't want to do that, didn't want to have the conference held in Bonn, and also thought that its chances were better to negotiate with Australia and request that Australia pull out rather than do the same of Turkey. At least that's what the report officially says. And so the end result is that it looks like the award will actually go to Turkey as a result of Australia deciding to not oppose the candidacy of Turkey. And the final decisions will be made at the end of the week, so we still need to wait a few more days to see the official communiques. But for all intents and purposes, we now know that the conference will go to Turkey. So where does this actually leave everyone, and what are the implications? Well, in the first instance, it's really unusual that a country like Australia, in particular, waited until such a late notice period, or so late in the game, to actually decide to withdraw its bid, because the rules associated with breaking this deadlock would have been known for some time. And those consultations could have gone on with Germany and with Turkey quite a lot sooner than they currently have. And so we're now here probably about a year away from the actual conference, and only now has Australia decided to withdraw. So this is a reasonably interesting dynamic, and one can only assume from that Australia had believed along the way that eventually Turkey, on the basis of maybe some sort of visibility that the more popular choice would have been Australia, that Turkey would have actually decided to withdraw from the bid. So in effect, it looks as though, until we get further information to the contrary, Australia had underestimated Turkey's resolve to actually host the conference. And that's a really important point. So in other words, Turkey has really dug in, has used all of its diplomatic channels and all of its resilience to hold on and force pressure on Australia to make this decision. And in doing so has sort of revealed that Australia may have underestimated the unity of other countries outside the Western European and others group to actually support Turkey. And so that's a really important insight. Another important insight is that Australia actually had been preparing as though it would be hosting this conference, and given 1 year's notice is quite a short amount of time to host groupings of up to 50,000 people, some preparation work was going on in Australia, and it has now been revealed that there's been quite a lot of expenditure, and just from the state government alone, the South Australian government, there were reports coming out that around about $4 million had been spent already on preparations for the conference. That's about $1.5 million of administrative costs, as well as another $2.5 million relating to the preparation of the South Australian Police. Now, that's just the state government. It doesn't include any expenditures that have been incurred by the federal government along the way. But this is a fairly significant amount of money, even though the number itself probably sounds quite small relative to the budgets of things like state governments and also federal governments. But this is $4 million of taxpayer funds that were spent on something where it was reasonably foreseeable that there was going to need to be a deadlock-breaking solution, and there was a fairly high risk that the conference would either be going to Germany in the event of a non-agreement, if you like, between the two candidate countries, or it would end up going to Turkey. So that is a significant issue, and it probably will need to be explained a lot better in due course by the relevant politicians. Minister Bowen, the Climate Change Minister of Australia, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and possibly also the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas. So there's probably going to need to be some more discussion about why those expenditures were incurred in an environment where the probability of success of the bid itself was reasonably low, and also there were other channels that could have been pursued that could have facilitated and made a decision on this a lot sooner than within 12 months of the actual conference. The other really important point here is that there could be implications for the Pacific Islands, and in one sense, the Pacific Islands were relying very heavily on this bid being successful, so that attention could be drawn to Pacific Island issues relating to climate change and overall security and development. And now that focus is not going to quite be so strong. As part of the deal with Turkey, we understand that there will be a pre-COP meeting of world leaders or senior officials going to the Pacific Islands to have a meeting and draw some attention to the region, but it's certainly not the same as having the overall Conference of the Parties in the region. So there is some dissatisfaction from the Pacific Islands, and in an environment, as I said before, where Australia is trying to demonstrate its wares and have some diplomatic victories to underpin and bolster its credentials with the Pacific Islands in the context of this competition, particularly with China, as I mentioned before. This does seem to be a bit of a blow for Australia. So more analysis will need to be done on the implications of that in due course. Probably the final thing just to observe is that Germany itself had had no real interest in hosting the conference, and was not willing to tolerate the idea of hosting the conference next year itself, and actually went to Australia rather than Turkey to request that outcome was not actually the final outcome of these negotiations. And that would also suggest that, in a situation where Germany has the city where the Secretariat is held, they have all the facilities there to host such a meeting, actually did host a Pacific Islands-focused Conference of the Parties as recently as 2017, would seem to suggest that Germany is shying away a little bit from either the expenditures or the profile that would come from having such a conference, if in fact these reports are true, as they've been reported in places like Carbon Pulse. So this is also very interesting, because it does, that would suggest that there's maybe a little bit of reticence on the behalf of Germany, and that may be an indicator that overall the economic conditions in Germany are taking grip, and excess expenditures are being avoided to the extent that is possible and necessary. So lots of really interesting information. Just a final matter is that it's understood that Australia will still actually be chairing the Conference of the Parties, the 31st one next November or December, but the physical location will be in Antalya in Turkey. So those are the early implications, if you like, of this decision. I thought it was important to actually discuss this with you, the channel members and the channel community, to understand what were the real implications resulting from this decision, what the costs are, what the ramifications are. But what do you think? I'd like to know. Please feel free to make a comment in the comments section below. Let me know, is not having the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Australia a major blow to Australia's climate ambitions, or perhaps is it a blessing in disguise? Was it a conference that Australia did not need to host? What do you think about the implications? Is this a big deal for Australia's diplomatic relations with the Pacific Islands? Please let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you've liked the video, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.